I don't know if we need any more time.
I'm really enjoying wearing this jacket. Yeah, do we need more time?
It is a nice jacket.
I'm enjoying wearing it, but it feels like I shouldn't be wearing it indoors. I don't know why. I have this intense desire to take my coat off, and then whenever I get close to doing it, I'm like, no, I like it.
Was it you who told me when I first came over here that wearing a jacket indoors is considered rude? It might have been you.
No.
Okay, well, someone told me that, and I was like, what?
Say anything like
I don't know, I like wearing jackets. So, yeah. I think you should keep wearing it, Dan.
I'm going to try. I might take it off halfway through.
All right, well, that's fair.
See. Jack's made me green tea.
I've made you green tea.
It's all very nice.
Hopefully it's good.
We've got a distinctly autumnal feeling. I've got an autumnal feeling.
Yeah, God.
Which is one of my most hated feelings.
Yeah, as you will know, dear listener, one of our most hated feelings.
Oh yeah, let's just go back to that.
Real heads remember.
2 years on and we're back to complaining about the onset of winter. Yeah, great.
I mean, winter sucks. What are you going to do?
We haven't gotten over it. Floods abroad being soon.
Well, I was just about to say, an old man at the allotment, I was like, should I plant some garlic right now? Because I want to plant garlic, onions. I have spinach already in, and beans for the winter. And I was talking to this old man about when to plant them, and he was like, I plant all of my garlic on Guy Fawkes Day. I was like, is there a reason for that? And he was like, no. So I'm probably not going to wait a month to do that, but I might put it in soon. We'll have some bean updates. That'll be fun. Yeah. So, got that going for us. England, Dan.
I know, it's going great, isn't it?
How's it going? It doesn't seem too great.
I am particularly enjoying this new government's effort to totally tank our economy.
Yeah, man. Oh, boy. Incredibly funny. And you know what? I bet you in like... It's incredibly funny. And I bet you in like a year, people are going to be like, it all started when the Queen died. They're going to like use that as a beginning. Like, oh my God, yeah, when the Queen died.
Yeah.
It's this new royalty.
Yeah. Everybody's like picking their start date for the end times.
Yeah, exactly.
And what kind of sicko is going to pick the day the Queen died? A fair few, I would imagine.
A fair few. I got a news alert on my phone.
This is a country of sickos.
It is.
Clearly,
it certainly is.
Stealing Jack's language for describing people.
Syphilitic sickos.
Yeah.
I got a news alert on my phone today that was like breaking news. And I was like, oh my God, breaking news. And it was like Queen's death ruled old age. I was like, okay, yeah. I was like, I could have told you that. Jeez.
So, I get a lot of those. I'm like, they're always incredibly alarming, right? Like, breaking news. And then,
Queen was old.
Yeah. I had a weird one today that was like, it was quoting Liz Truss saying that like they were going to dramatically intervene to fix the economic woes of the country. And I'm like,
sure.
You've already dramatically intervened.
Yeah. Incredibly funny that they just kind of came out and were like, how are we going to fix this really shitty situation? And they were like, we're going to just give all of the rich people a huge tax cut, and just everything fell apart like within a day. Just like pound is almost at the dollar. Like things are just falling apart. What do you know?
There's this like constant question of like, do the people in power, are they somehow just like purely evil? Or are they operating on some kind of sort of capitalist ideological rationale?
Sure.
Are they playing some kind of like somewhat clever systemic game? Obviously it's not. Obviously their logics are ideological. But like, is it part of some complex ideology building schema that manages to advance the interests of the capitalist class while managing to convince the proletarians that they're on their side,
Yeah.
Or are they just idiots?
I think I'm beginning to think they're just idiots. I'm beginning to think
this particular crop are just idiots who believe the ideology. So they're so pure in their commitment.
Yeah. It's farcical. It's very farcical. It's like each person's stupider than the next. And it's funny because I had no like exposure to, I almost said Liz Truss, like prior to this. And she just seems like bumbling. And like, I don't know if she was always a bit of like a bumbling fool, or if that's just like, they were like, hey, it worked for Boris. People like, kind of a funny idiot, kind of same thing with Trump. Or if she was just always kind of this like, I don't know.
I mean, we knew she was this. Like,
okay. It's not a new thing.
It's not a new thing.
Okay,
yeah. There are many YouTube montages of Liz Truss being nutty in various different ways.
Oh dear.
One of a Tory lord called Daniel Hannan, who was particularly prominent during the debates around Brexit. He was a prominent Brexiteer.
Sure.
I think he was a member of the European Parliament for a while. tweeted something about the IMF revealing itself to be a left-wing institution.
Classically left-wing, of course.
And that's when you really know, like when you know that one of the like primary global institutions advancing sort of like
suffering
neoliberal capitalist hegemony is criticizing your your economic interventions. You either wonder whether you've gone a bit too far. You've kind of like the mask has slipped a little bit, and you've failed to grasp what it is that a bourgeois state is intended to do. Either that, or you just declare them left wing, like you just say the BBC's left wing because I don't know, they have comedians on occasion.
Yeah, exactly. Well, give it a few days, and all the liberals will be like, "I've always said the IMF is the liberal thing." They'll be like, "How dare you attack the IMF, this bastion of progressive values?" What are you gonna do? Speaking of powerful women, Dan, Italy. They have they elected the first female prime minister.
So congratulations to them.
Yeah, congratulations to them. I haven't read anything else about it.
No, but that's all that matters.
It's great.
All that matters. Yeah.
All that matters. I've been getting the feeling more and more that like, well, I'd always kind of figured the 30s. Maybe it's just because of like the American association with the 30s as just being like Hooverville and just like disasters and like. But I've always kind of had the feeling that the 30s aren't going to be too great. The 2030s, that is. And I was kind of beginning to feel like it's the 20s. Don't confuse me for a second, but the 20s seems, or maybe
I
they're
think
just
the
both
last time
be
the fascists came to power in Italy was 1922. So,
oh god, what's going on with Italy? Have there, I don't know. Have there just always? I don't know anything about Italian politics, so I probably shouldn't be talking about this. But I wonder what state the left is in there, et cetera, et cetera. It'd be good to know.
Yeah, I don't really know either, and I was talking to some Italians about this at the weekend. I guess I was speculating that their sort of populist moment manifested in the Five Star movement in Italy, which was their equivalent to Syriza or Podemos in some ways, or they were a particular kind of anti-political populism that actually, I think, proved itself to be quite politically naive, quite keen to sort of ally with everybody kind of thing, really trying to do middle ground politics and not really realizing that...
Have we tried that before? Has that worked?
I mean, we're constantly in the middle ground of politics. We're constantly being peddled.
Yeah.
But why it was that it had this... why its populist moment took this sort of like particularly centrist and liberal fashion, I don't really know. Is it the legacy of the Italian Communist Party, its size, and then its eventual collapse? Who knows? Anyway, we should learn about some Italian politics because it was.
Are you telling us to read some Bordiga?
It's been eventful. We should read some Bordiga. We should read, I don't know, some Tronti. Who knows?
Gramsci.
We should read some Gramsci.
I feel like a lot of the Marxism I first encountered was like university types, and a lot of people in that kind of milieu really like Gramsci. But the more that I've kind of like, I don't know, continued my own like exploration of the topic, a lot of people don't like Gramsci. I know when we started, Ralph Miliband was like, Gramsci is the only person to come across, ideology and to try and figure it out and all of this stuff. But I don't know, more and more, like the examples that we came across, I think like Ellen Meakson's Wood or something like that, where they bring up Gramsci as just being like way off the mark. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't know anything about Gramsci. I mean, I guess perhaps my sense of it is, this isn't really my take, but my sense of it is that in 10 or 15 years ago, in a sort of like in university departments that were obsessed with cultural critique and literary theory, and these were the bastions of Marxism as it existed in academic institutions, having a really cryptic, strange text to have to sort of parse was probably the sort of height of academic activity. So maybe there was a lot of fascination with Gramsci. I don't know.
Wow,
but
I
also
don't
maybe
understand
it did sort of, maybe also he sort of like, he's come to represent an effort to, I suppose, find some kind of like quote unquote like third way with Marxism, this kind of like a different way to interpret and understand what the failings of the Marxist political project were
Yeah.
in a way which allows you to turn to the study of culture, I suppose.
Yeah, everybody everybody definitely has their own why did Marxism fail like bugbear, like thing that they all really love. Like everybody is guilty of that. So I don't what's the word? I'm not mad at anybody for doing that. I don't know why I'd be mad, but like everybody's got that. What are you gonna do?
I know why you'd be mad, because like people on the left are always mad at other people on the
Yeah,
left.
it's true. Yeah, exactly.
Well, why am I mad? Expect you to be mad. It is
Yeah.
important to clarify,
Yeah.
we are not mad.
Yeah, Marxists. They ruined Marxism. Bastards. Speaking of cryptic texts, Dan, should we get into it? We've put it off long enough. We're back, and we are finishing Capitalism in the Web of Life. We have finished it.
We
read
finished it. And
3
we're
and 4?
about to finish our summation of it.
Yes.
In our own particular and unique fashion.
Unique fashion. I like that. In our own unique fashion. I really wound up digging this book a lot. I kind of almost wonder, because I know that we want to do some more ecology in the future. I almost wonder if we should have read this like after, because now I'm kind of just like, oh, I kind of like agree with him on like so much stuff. And he gets to a lot of critiques in here about people like Andreas Malm, who I haven't really been exposed to too much, and like, you know, like the metabolic rift stuff, which we have been exposed to, but I almost kind of feel like this was a bit of the final boss of like
Yeah,
the
it's just
current
the kind of
Marxist
like
ecology.
galaxy brain
Yeah,
part of
yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly. But I really, great choice again, Dan, because I really wound up loving this. He, well, I say I loved it.
It's been a struggle, hasn't it?
It's been a struggle, and it's also just like, oh God. I mean, when your last line is, but for how much longer? Question mark. It's like, okay, I didn't exactly come up with a
I
good
can't remember whether
feeling.
you asked on mic last week or it was subsequently in conversations that we've had. You've wondered whether is he going to end on a high?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think there
don't
were
know.
some positives. There are some
were
positives to talk about.
Yeah, and he kind of is like, because for the royal listener, this kind of parts 3 and 4 in the conclusion, he's kind of getting into like a bit of his history, but also a bit of like tracing where the current crisis that we're in now has come from. It's longue durée, but also it's like specific cyclical origins. And it doesn't seem very good. But I don't know. He will get into why, but he puts this crisis, this current crisis, as kind of like, obviously he's got his big brain dialectical thing, so he's like, it's everything, man. It's all connected. But it's also like the connection, the relationship between cheap food and labor power is perhaps what's bringing on what he says is maybe an ultimate crisis of capitalism, an epochal crisis. But he also sprinkles it, as you say, with a bit of positives and a bit of like, well, it's going to have to change, so maybe for the better. It's like, yeah, maybe for the better. I mean, that would be really cool. Or we'll just all be eating bugs. You know what I mean? We'll see.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I suppose we're not at one of those moments in history where there's either the possibility that capitalism revivifies itself by creating some kind of new historic paradigm, by finding some way to renew its access to these 4 cheaps that we talked about in previous weeks, but we're not at a moment in history where that's possible, or we have socialism. I suppose this is the kind of like socialism or barbarism becoming socialism, or something worse than barbarism.
Extinction.
Right? Yeah. And he does end with the something close to placing us in a paradigm which is more like socialism or extinction.
Yes.
But he does talk about socialism, and he talks about it in a fairly concrete way, if briefly, and one which I think piqued my interest. I think it will pique our mutual
interests. Yeah. I was trying to kind of figure out what would be a good place to maybe start. And as I told you, I did my notes in reverse chronological order. So I'm going to go to the end of my notes. I don't know why I did that.
It's got to be dialectical somehow.
It's dialectical thing. Well, my first note is negative values. Maybe we don't start with that. My last note, though, there's a paragraph in here, half a paragraph, where I put a little heart at the end because I love it so much. I thought that this was just really like, it was awesome. It was great writing. It was really, really good. And I think it sums up kind of why he's taking the approach that he does. So I'll read it real quick. He says, and to give a bit of background, he's kind of critiquing, not so veiled Andreas Malm, I think, to talk about like his fossil capitalism and about like why you can't pinpoint the beginning of capitalism with like the steam engine or using coal or something like that. So he says, to locate the origins of the modern world within the steam engine and the coal pit is to prioritize shutting down the steam engines and the coal pits and their 21st century incarnations. But to locate the origins of the modern world with the rise of capitalist civilization after 1450, with its audacious strategies of global conquest Endless commodification and relentless rationalization is to prioritize the relations of power, capital, and nature that rendered fossil capitalism so deadly in the first place. Shut down a coal plant, and you can slow global warming for a day. Shut down the relations that made the coal plant, and you can stop it for good. And I think that that's really like, in that, I kind of really finally understood why he's taking the time to put forward this like new ontology and new methodology for understanding the relationship between nature and capitalism, or the web of life. Because once you really situate capitalism as being within the web of life and not this external thing to nature, as both of them acting through each other, you come to completely different conclusions. And a lot of my thinking on this book was like, well, how useful is this? How politically useful is it to actually like frame things like this? And I think hugely useful, because he's right. Because once you realize that like, oh, we're just in the web of life, dude, your conclusions then become, okay, well, we need like a paradigm shift, and not just to get rid of like the nuclear power plants or whatever. And it's really fantastic.
Yeah, I think early on when we were reading this book, I had some, maybe not complaints, but sort of like difficulties with his presenting an intellectual schema which it felt like was sort of light on examples and applications. And it does feel like the latter stages of this book focus much more on the concrete history of this period and the real world applications, the real world implications of this sort of theoretical schema, I suppose. He does start these later chapters that we read with him introducing, or with him criticizing the concept of the Anthropocene, and he sort of, it's quite common now in people's understanding, replacing that with the term Capitalocene, which sort of comes down, which is his critique of Anthropocene and his preference for Capitalocene hinges around some of the things that come up in that quote, right? It's this, for one, he criticizes the Anthropocene, people who advocate the idea of the Anthropocene as dating the onset of this historical period far too late. He's talking about like the people are thinking about the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, rather than his sort of like long 16th century, and the way he explains his definition for Capitalocene and his criticism of Anthropocene is in the context of this idea that with Anthropocene, what you are criticizing is specific technologies, specific energy sources, and ultimately what you're criticizing is like the activity of human beings as some kind of like totality that is coming back to his broader critique, which is separated from nature in a way that we shouldn't separate it, and is representative of this dualist thinking which he criticizes throughout the book, but rather, yes, we should look to how the social relations that allow these technologies and allow these forms of power and class domination and this particular relationship to nature, what are the social relations that allow these things to come about? And the origins of those are to be dated much earlier than the 19th century and require intellectual schema that is much broader than what's usually presented in language and conversations around the Anthropocene. So I don't know. Did you appreciate in any way his sort of like discussion of the origins of capitalism in this book relative to ones that we've come across in the past? Because I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm not sure what I've come away with. I'm very sympathetic to it. And I was basically, as ever, I'm constantly trying to like work out how to relate it to, sure, Brenner and Ellen Nixon's work.
Yeah. Well, I think as ever, I would like to know a little bit more about, he's taking that framework, I think, from Origi and a couple other people as well, this idea of the long 15th, 16th century. Yeah. And I think as ever, when you're trying to figure out historically when something began, you can have a million different answers and all of them be right. Well, not all of them, but a few of them be right? And I do think that the Brenner Wood kind of idea of like focusing on this qualitative shift in the relations is like vital, because that is when you can kind of go, okay, well, here's where it really began. But also like what he's saying about like, and even what Galeano was saying about like primitive accumulation and all of this stuff, like, all of that stuff could have happened and maybe things went a different direction, but it isn't until you get to that qualitative shift in labor relations that you actually can say, okay, beginning of capitalism. So I understand why they say that, but I also totally understand why he's saying it here. And I think that, like, really maybe in 1450 on, you do really actually start to see a difference in the relationship of, like, humanity and nature. I hate to say that, but, like, you know, you do start to see upped appropriation. But the danger in that is talking about, you know, as the origin of capitalism, is you can kind of drag that back even further. You can go, well, actually, if we're looking as capitalism as just like the oikios, right, as this relationship of world building that both parties, you know, play a role in mutually, you could go all the way back to like the 1200s or the 1100s when there was like this class conflict and feudalism, which isn't helpful because that just is a completely different mode, where appropriation started to go up because of that class conflict. But I don't know, I do appreciate it, and I think that he wouldn't have done himself any favors by only talking about things, you know, beginning with the enclosures, right? Or beginning with dispossessing peasants of their land and people becoming wage laborers. I think for his kind of framework, maybe he does need to go a bit further back than that, but as with everything, it's always a process. And I mean, whether it just depends on what you define as a mode of production. You can define a mode of production as only beginning when it takes the state form. You can define it as once primitive accumulation starts. But yeah, I don't know. I think I'm more and more, I really do appreciate the Brunner Wood thesis if I had to pick something, but it's also like, it is all a process. And there is never one moment where you can point to one thing. And as he says in this, and makes a really good point, like capitalism is evolving every single day. So yeah, I think I appreciated it, I suppose, but also, like, yeah, it was the enclosures, damn it.
I think it's a really good text if you're, as we are, sometimes struggling with this idea of where is the continuity and where is the change kind of thing. He is both, he definitely recognizes the onset of capitalism as being a sort of qualitative shift in social relations, and it's very definitely not like a incremental quantitative change, which is what Ellen Mixins-Wood criticizes most often when things that she's read when she's talking about theories of the change in mode of production from feudalism to capitalism. Yeah, I definitely liked it for expanding my understanding of the importance of primitive accumulation and the relationship of imperialism in this period, but not just imperialism. Actually, he doesn't. I don't think what he's saying is capitalism starts with imperialist projects in the New World. Sure. He definitely like recognizes that there's something happening already in Western Europe. The thing that I was looking for, because he emphatically says that, okay, there has been a qualitative change, and he does give definitions for what that qualitative difference is. But what I didn't really find, and what I'm always looking for, is why. Yeah. Why did this happen? Yeah. And other than a sort of general crisis in feudalism that comes about because of the Black Death, I didn't extract something. Now, that's probably because I did a poor and partial reading.
No,
never.
That could not be.
Yeah, as podcasters, we peddle in pure and partial readings.
True. And then give our takes.
That is our forte.
Yes, exactly. Get comfortable with it.
Yeah. But I was I was thinking about it, and obviously, like, what he puts forward as this qualitative difference is the idea that feudalism is interested in the productivity of land and capitalism is interested in the productivity of labor. And I think that is a distinction that we would recognize from sort of the Brenner school of thought as well. Sure. So there is a big overlap here, as well as there is an overlap between emphatically saying there is a qualitative difference. I was having a little think about it, because when we read Ellen Mixins-Wood, what I came away with was this particular focus on the distinction between economic as opposed to extra economic exploitation. And so when I was previously thinking about the idea of colonialism, I was like, okay, from the reading of Mixon's Wood, I come away with this idea of, okay, there's a specific type of colonialism which is extra economic, and there's a particular type of colonialism which has capitalist dynamics and it's focused on economic exploitation. Whereas I feel like with his particular focus on a new interest in the productivity of labor, and also with his particular focus on the sort of like the external, the necessity of an externality to capitalism, which we've previously talked about as like cheap and abundant nature of various sorts. He talks about like human natures as well as like ecological natures. He is necessarily going to have this sort of starting point of capitalism that has this kind of blurred overlap between this intersection or interaction between nascent capitalism and a kind of like ecological frontier. And I guess what he is focusing on most specifically is how this necessity to increase the productivity of labor interacts with the ecological frontier. And I guess when we read the Galliano, for example, what he's focusing on is all of these interactions with nature include some kind of effort to use nature to increase the productivity of labor, kind of thing. I don't know whether there's a tension there at all between
maybe
his distinction and
I kind of just saw the Galliano as just being like primitive accumulation. That's kind of it.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you're right. He does talk about Potosi in this. He's like, it isn't until like this point that you start to get like, okay, no, now we need to really appropriate things because it's not like the silver isn't just laying there. I mean, obviously I know nothing about silver mining. Presumably it's not just laying there. Presumably it's a lot harder to get. But yeah. I think he's absolutely right to make things very relational in every single aspect of what he's talking about, because that's extremely like old school, just real Marxist thing to do. And I really love. I know I'm going to fuck this up, so I'm just going to look at it. When he talks about value, he says that it's not an economic form with systemic consequences, which I feel like a lot of people make the mistake of just thinking that, you learn that value is exchange value, it's abstract labor, and you just go, okay, that's it. That's all that matters. But in reality, it's like, well, nobody could be doing that labor if there wasn't like air, you know what I mean? Or like food or any of these things. So to just focus on the economic aspect of it all is really silly. And, he is right to focus on the relations, because then he goes on to say that value to him is a systemic relation with a pivotal economic expression. And that's like a good way to get out of it, because it's like, okay, obviously socially necessary labor time, the drive to drive all of that down is like pivotal in all of this, but none of this happens without an environment. It's very reminiscent of cybernetics, and like the reason that Stafford Beer's viable system model includes the environment in the model of the thing that you're looking at. It's the reason that like Matron and Varela looked at autopoiesis as their starting point for how you can define life, because it's like nothing exists in a vacuum, and to not focus on the relationship to the environment, to not realize that it's all part of the same process, is to just get everything wrong. And I think that is hugely important in political thinking, I think, because like economics is boring, but it's also like you need to make the connection to people where it's like, it's a very strong message to be like, hey, you go to work every day, it sucks, you're being exploited, here's why, your boss just takes everything from you. But it's also like, you have no access to land, you have no food, you have dirty drinking water, the air is always polluted. Something like 2/3 of everybody on the planet doesn't have access to like food security, all of this different stuff. So to really make it relational in that little thing of it's like value isn't this economic expression with like a systemic expression or whatever. It is rather relational. And so you do really need to understand that nothing exists independent of its environment. And I suppose what he's saying here is that the environment and the thing that you're looking at, the model, it's all one big web. It's all one big web of life. So yeah, it's really interesting him mapping that onto the historical debate. And he goes on at the end of the book to say, I fucking wish he just did this at the beginning of the book. Maybe he did. I just don't remember. It was a long time ago. Where he says, I'm making an ontological claim, a methodological claim, and then also a historical analytical claim. And it's like, wow, I guess that's why he spent 70 pages at the beginning talking about the oikios. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, okay. Now it all makes sense. Should have made fun of his Twitter handle. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I was wondering whether there's some kind of dialectical method at play when you just give the answer at the end rather than
tricky.
You can only understand being given the really plain answer once you've trudged through all of the sort of ins and outs of the ontological argument that it's laid out in all of its various
You have to struggle.
Yeah.
He's a Trotskyist. The working class learned through struggle, dude.
Yeah. I also really enjoyed that that quote that you just said. And in some ways, it impacted what I was just talking about a minute ago, which was I was kind of wondering whether if we were to be incredibly unnuanced and unfair, we could say that maybe the sort of like the Brennerite thesis as we've interpreted, or I'll say as I've interpreted it, falls into the trap of seeing value as an economic thing with a systemic expression kind of thing.
Yeah.
If we're to make this hard distinction between, okay, previously they were doing exploitation by violence and in an extra economic way, and then suddenly we switch and we have capitalism and it's all internal to this relationship between the sort of like employer-labor relationship. All of the exploitation happens there. All of what is important happens internal to the labor relation where that exploitation takes place. And he's saying no. It's coming back to this thing we've talked about in previous episodes, and he talks about all the way through this, right? Like, value under capitalism is the value of the labor in the abstract. But what's far more important is all of those sort of external cheap natures kind of thing. What's being valued is the labor. Its sort of form and its appearance is the labor, but behind that is all of this far more important.
I like that a lot.
Far more important, like maybe not more important, but like essential appropriation is what he would say. All of this essential appropriation of nature is what allows for the exploitation of labor to take place, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is what he's getting at. I think is what he's getting at when he's talking about it being value being a systemic thing with an economic expression, right? Like it's much bigger than something internal to the labor relationship. It's something which reaches far beyond that kind of thing.
Yeah,
which is more systemic.
It is. Yeah, it's life making. It is just life making, and it's really phenomenal to see someone really put that together with a critique of capitalism, a Marxist critique of capitalism. It's really fantastic, really, really good. As much as we complain about this book, fucking read it because it's really phenomenal. And then I get So we'll keep talking about history a bit going forward, but I think that like one of the main points of what we read today was to talk about, which I think you're getting to, is to talk about his main point that okay, now we've learned all of this. But capitalism is kind of like, at this point, it's exhausting. It's ecological regime, perhaps. And I love that phrase, ecological regime, because it is life making, and you really understand that it's like, okay, capitalism is just one way of organizing nature, and nature organizing, the other thing. It's all dualist, man, or it's not dualist. Oh my god. But it's really interesting because...
Dialectical, man.
Dialectical, yeah, exactly. Because he makes this distinction about, like, there's the longue durée of capitalism, right? Where it's like, it's this thing that operates using value as its kind of economic measurement, but then also, like, it really requires appropriation. It requires the four cheaps. It requires cheap food, cheap labor power, energy, raw materials, I think. It requires all this stuff, and it needs to be appropriated. To focus solely on the exploitation is to kind of miss the point and to maybe miss what he might think is going to actually cause the end of capitalism. But then he says that there are also these like other little mini cycles where capitalism kind of exhausts one ecological regime, and so it has to kind of formulate a kind of one that conforms to that general idea of exploitation and appropriation and value, but also does things slightly differently, right? So there's like going to the New World and just taking things. He talks a lot about agriculture as being really the pivotal thing that needs to be reorganized constantly, because one way that capitalism is organizing things fucks everything up. So then it has to go on to this new way of organizing things. And And I think that that's a really helpful distinction. And I suppose what he's saying is that like maybe that longue durée, maybe that is actually kind of coming to an end because this ecological regime is hitting a point with food production and with climate change and global warming that it just can't keep it up. It's not fun. But he gets into talking about those little mini changes in capitalism, starting with, I suppose, like kind of like the Brennerist era of like, once there were enclosures, there was one type of farming and everything. And then they realized pretty quickly, say specifically talking about England, that they'd exhausted a lot of the soil fertility. And all of this cheap food was it was getting really expensive and it seemed like things were going to collapse. And so he said, what's the one thing that saved capitalism's cheap food production after, I think he says like the early 1800s, like 1815.
I think his date is the Napoleonic Wars.
Sure.
Just immediately after the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah. Yeah. And he says it's America.
Yeah.
Which is, it's this entire continent where they just go and fix things.
And coming back to one of our previous episodes, like the outcome, he specifically references the American Constitution.
Yeah.
As being something which
God,
allows for this new sort of agricultural paradigm to come into play, which then allows for the revivification of English capitalism and the onset of the first industrial revolution.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Dan. Mad King George. Yeah, that was really fascinating. He is basically very specifically talking about allowing people to go west from the Appalachian Mountains, basically, and opening up this, entire continent that was empty, right? There was nothing there at all. But then it's very interesting because he talks about how that only lasted for so long because then the same thing happened. You can no longer freely appropriate the microbes and the soil fertility and everything. So you have to come up with something brand new. And he says that around World War II, I suppose it started like in the 30s, and we talked about this in the last episode, American agriculture completely changed because it had to, because the soil was being, it was being, what's the word? Wasted? Depleted, thank you. So they had to come up with a new way of doing things. And he talks about a really interesting shift in American agriculture that then became the global model of, of doing things in a really much worse way. He talks a lot about seeds, and he talks about genetically modified corn production, maize being grown that can be drought resistant. He talks a lot about, we'll come back to seeds because he had a really fascinating point on like capitalizing on seeds, which is very brutal. But he is now saying that kind of like industrialized agriculture that was developed in the 30s and the 40s is on its way out and it can't be sustained. And for a number of reasons. One is because, as we've talked about a lot in the past, monoculture and just pumping the soil full of more and more each season fertilizers, it just ruins the soil and it makes it so that you're eventually just going to have to put, like only fertilizers, but then that's not going to be able to do anything because you just have sand. You don't have soil anymore. But he also says that there are things like super weeds, and genetically modified crops that no longer increase yields. All they do is they just don't die when you put Roundup on them. But hey, that's spread to the weeds, and now none of the weeds are dying when you put Roundup on them. And he's basically comes to the conclusion, to wind it up, that because of climate change and because of all of these different things, genetically modified corn and super weeds and droughts and unpredictable weather patterns, that this is now an epochal crisis of food production. Because this type of food production has been exported globally, the world is now doing it like this. Things are coming to a complete collapse because there's no way out to keep capitalizing on these things. Everything in the soil has been appropriated. We've tried everything. And now with climate change, you're done. So you're going to have to figure out something different, which is not a fun thought.
Yeah, he's definitely implying we're at a crisis point.
Yeah.
It's funny, like, he has this, all the way through the book, obviously, he's had this language of the four cheaps. But toward the end, he seems to sort of, like, focus much more on two of those, labor and food, and the relationship between the two. I think the implication is that, like, if you cannot provide cheap food, you cannot ensure the reproduction of labor, or
that it's just going to be way too expensive, and you just won't profit because just the necessary labor time is just going to go way up.
Yeah. But being able to sustain cheap labor is dependent on being able to sustain cheap food, I suppose.
Cheap commodities. Yeah.
one of the interesting things that he talks about, which you just highlighted, is that there was this agricultural revolution. He calls it the green agricultural revolution.
Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure where that
didn't
language
seem
comes
very
from.
green to me.
Starting in the kind of like 1930s and accelerating in the post-war era, I suppose, which includes all the sort of like particularly brutal things you've just described. But he talks about that as a kind of like a pattern of behavior or an approach which has been applied much sooner in history to other aspects of the Four Chiefs, right? The relationship to energy and the relationship to raw materials is already written through with all of these sort of like brutal techniques. He talks about, it's an interesting language, he talks about nature as both being a tap and a sink. It is this sort of like thing which capitalism exploits for its cheap but increasingly more expensive raw materials. Those things, they're sort of like uncapitalized resources, I suppose, to come back to the language we've used in previous episodes. But also it's this sink where you can like dump to sort of all of this waste. And when it comes to sort of like the extraction of commodities for the generation of power and just like and also the waste from that generation of power, particularly the most important one of those being like CO2, right? One of the biggest ways capitalism uses the environment as a sink is just sort of pump all of this sort of CO2 into the atmosphere. Just keep doing it. And it's been capitalism obviously has been doing that since the 19th century, and it's been exploiting human natures all the way back to the 16th century kind of thing. But it only starts to apply these techniques or this sort of particularly brutal rationale to food generation in this sort of like post-war period, as you say, with GMO crops, but with like monoculture agriculture. But then in terms of like the sink, right, it's just like all of the pesticides, but then again, and then sort of all of the runoff into the rivers kind of thing. This sort of like total toxification of the environment. Like food production now is one of the most brutal and toxifying aspects of capitalist production, I suppose. And it's sort of gotten to the point where that is now beginning to bite back. And he talks about this language of negative value. I'm not entirely sure what he meant by negative value as opposed to surplus value. But I think the two examples of it that he uses are climate change and, as you say, superweeds.
Hell yeah,
but superweeds seems to, initially it means capitalism has created this particular environment where evolutionary pressures have led to the generation of weeds which are resistant to pesticides. And he talks about other historical examples of agricultural areas becoming unviable for capitalism because weeds have become too prevalent. He talks about it in like the 18th century where food for England that was grown in, I think he talks like Barbados. Eventually, they had to move like sugar production from Barbados to Jamaica because just the work that had to go into suppressing these weeds just became too much. It just became inefficient to do it there. But in that instance, there was an externality, right? There was another place to go. There was more cheap, exploitable nature somewhere else. But the case he's making now in the 21st century, where we're at, we've basically toxified the entire world. Yeah. There aren't new places to go and implement this model. But yeah, so you've got the superweeds, but then superweeds seems to have a more broader application in terms of, he initially talks about antibiotic resistance that comes from factory farming, and then he even goes on to sort of like pandemic generation, with the relationship between agriculture and nature. All of these kind of things generally fall under this rubric of capitalism creating evolutionary environments which lead to these negative values. These things which actually sap and make impossible for the generation of value to continue.
Yeah, it is particularly galling. It sucks. I mean, I guess he brought up this idea of the general law of overpollution, which I found really fascinating. Which I think, to speak to what you're saying about negative value, he's basically just saying that capitalism is like dumping things faster and like enclosing areas for just waste faster than it can find new ones. And I think that that's part of negative value. Waste and toxicity threatening what zones of appropriation might already exist. But the other side of negative value is that new streams of appropriation aren't there. And that's what negative value is. It's like you can't find any more things to appropriate. Like you're saying, there's no Jamaica to just move sugarcane production to. But also, if there is anything left, it's being completely toxified and completely, ruined because of waste. And that's why he says that, climate change, global warming is the thing that's threatening a new kind of agricultural frontier the most, because it's this double pressure of no more zones of appropriation, and also what we have is just toxified. Sucks.
I mean, we could clear more of the Amazon, right? But all it would do was take away this carbon sink and contribute more to global warming, which is one of the biggest threats to the sustainability of capitalist agriculture, because it's just making it unviable in so many parts of the world. Yeah,
I was kind of on board with the super weeds for a little while. I was rooting for the super weeds. I was like, you know what? Good for you, nature. Fighting back. That's very cool. I love how at one point Monsanto had to come out and publicly say, ooh, yeah, these new GMO crops, they don't actually increase yield. They just make it so that they're harder to kill. It's like, okay, thanks a lot, Monsanto. Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah. Because that's his big point, right? Where the year on year, we've gotten to the point. I think he dates it as post 2003.
Yeah.
Year on year, we've got to the point now where agricultural yields are. I don't know whether they're actually actively being lessened, but they're expanding at a smaller and smaller rate, which is resulting in a price rise in food and food commodities.
And I think this is why his methodology is so important, is because it isn't, if you think about, people versus nature, then you kind of get into this, like, we're nearing the end. It's a complete collapse. But as, like, materialists and as people who aren't interested in that kind of, like, dualist approach, we understand that no, there are solutions. There are plenty of solutions. We could produce more than enough for everybody to have a very good life, but we just have to completely rework our, like, ecological regime, quote unquote, and obviously, like, this whole capitalism thing to do that. But to get back really quick to talk about the seed stuff, I was really fascinated with that story he talks about of in the 30s, once people were like, we can genetically modify maize to make it much, much better. Like, obviously, sweet corn as we know it now is not like how this thing grows in the wild, right? Or like the corn that they use for ethanol or whatever. And it's really interesting the way that he cited this book that I really want to get, where he talks about the way that seeds have been commercialized and how this, other than when he talks about the bees, this is what depressed me the most, because he's talking about how seeds have always been this thing that's just free, because it's like, pretty much everything that you grow, like potatoes, obviously you just keep a potato. Corn, you just keep a couple of kernels of corn, plant that for the next season, take seeds from everything that you make, and then you can just plant it later. That's free. That's just part of farming. But he's saying now the thing that's making this just so disgusting. I think the thing that freaks me out the most is whenever we see, I forget what we read, where we read the phrase mirror of the microbiological realm. It would have been Social Contagion, where they talk about how capitalism's social relations have penetrated into the microbiological realm. He's talking about the same thing, but he's talking about with seeds, and he's talking about the poor bees. Because with seeds, now genetically modified corn can't be grown from its seed, or it can't really be grown very well. You're not going to get the same thing. So there's just been this complete rentier system that's been set up where, I suppose before the 1930s, there were probably a lot of small farmers, right? And now there are none, right? It's just several companies in the United States who own pretty much everything. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you understand what I'm saying. Because you can't grow corn true from your seeds anymore, every season you have to go back and get seeds from like Monsanto or whoever the pricks are who make this GMO corn. And you kind of need those seeds to be competitive on the market. And I mean, if you're just a company that's sitting on top of that, oh my God, that's like the biggest choke point in the world. You have the seeds, you can no longer save seeds. That sucks. That really sucks. And he talks about that, a similar thing again when he talks about the bees. He's like, it's very mystic. Nobody really knows why the bees are disappearing. But here's one idea. It's because we've just industrialized beehives and bees aren't used to that.
Yeah, I had never come across this idea before, like the industrial application of
Yeah, it's a bummer.
Bees.
I've always
and, like,
wanted to
trucking
keep
them around
bees.
the country. Is that what they were doing? Trucking them around the country to?
I don't know. I suppose
like...
it's just that they probably shouldn't exist for pure honey production and exist in these little boxes where everything has to be perfect and they're in this one set area and they go in this one set area. I don't know. It fucking sucks, whatever it is.
Yeah, and they were just sort of giving them sugars to turn into honey, I think. So maybe there was even less necessity to...
Poor bees.
Let's just say
Leave the bees alone.
Leave the bees alone.
Oh God.
We need them. We
do need the bees.
Yeah. I mean, I guess any gardeners, any amateur farmers will have come across this idea of like hybrid seeds versus open pollinated seeds, right? Sometimes you go buy a packet of seeds and it's a F1 hybrid and you plant them all, but then if you were to try and sow those seeds again, they wouldn't produce the same fruit the next year, kind of thing, because they will have cross-pollinated with something else and have created some kind of monstrous toxic
thanks a lot, bees. Pricks.
Which seems to be what's happening with these sort of like Monsanto crops, right? Like you've got all these hybrid crops which have been genetically modified. I don't really know what that means, but air quotes or scare quotes, genetically modified to be more productive. But because they're a hybrid, they don't open pollinate, so you can't then gather the seeds up and replant them again.
Yeah. Well, and his point here, there is a lot of doom and gloom, and it feels a little bit like if you were to just take this logic to its conclusion, it's like, well, just wait for the collapse and then we'll swoop in and do the socialist thing, which is a little bit like, okay, that's not what we want to do. But his idea, he gets into a little bit to go to what you were saying at the very beginning of this episode. He does go into a little bit of like, well, what could post-capitalist food production look like? And that isn't the point of this book, so he doesn't get a lot into it. Go listen to the Poor Proles Almanac if you'd like to hear a little bit about that. He's very funny because he's like, what about permaculture? It's like, well, I don't know, man. That's the marketing scheme.
Farming,
yeah, exactly. But it is like, the super weeds suck. That's not good. But if you're just conscious about it and you like relocalize food production and you're planning like food that should be where you are, and you're not just doing monoculture, you bring the soil back to life. Easy peasy. It's just that there's no profit incentive to do that right now. And it would take, everybody would kind of have to do their part to make it happen. But yeah, I mean, it's not as simple as just saying, do permaculture, bro. Yeah, you and your super weeds and your permaculture. I see what you're saying. I'm reading between the lines, hippie. But yeah, I suppose that is to just say that there is hope, right? It's not like when you have this dualist framing of, man versus nature and we're just appropriating too much and we've stolen from good Gaia, Mother Earth or whatever, you're going to wind up with this idea of like there's no way forward. But it's like, no. Look at what capitalism has done. It's reworked its ecological regime a number of times. It's operated by the same rules for that entire time. But very much like, if we're conscious about it, sure, we can turn things around. You do it now. We need to be doing it right now. But yeah, it is entirely possible.
When I was reading this book, I remembered. I think I may have read something off of the T-shirt of somebody who was in like the Land Workers Alliance, I think, and this slogan or this demand was that more people should be farmers. We should increase the number of people working in agriculture, which makes sense, right? Because if you look at different organic or sustainable ways of farming, ones which could be part of a sort of like socialist ecology, they're quite labor intensive, right? Like
sure.
If you're going to do sort of like no dig, non-monocultured
Korean natural farming.
And I thought about this because when he starts his section on the sort of historic periodization of these sort of like various waves of what he calls capitalist agricultural revolutions, right? There's the one leading up to the onset of the Industrial Revolution. There's sort of the period of the Industrial Revolution. There's an early phase of American agriculture. There's a sort of green agricultural revolution that we were just talking about. Early on, he's talking about the problems that they're having in British farming, God knows, and that's leading to this sort of like increase in food prices. And he talks about the composition of labor to sort of technology kind of thing. And he's talking about the sort of like declining workforce in agriculture in Britain and basically Britain can't go back to having more people working in agriculture because what they want is more people to be working in the factories. And what they need to find is some kind of externality where they can bring more food in without increasing farming in the UK because they need that workforce for something else. But what seems central to this process is a sort of a development on Marx's discussion of the change in the sort of organic composition of capital, right? We know that capitalism favors technology over labor in the long run, even though the thing that gives its commodities value is the labor. It also has this tendency to decrease the amount of labor done and increase the amount of the contribution to the production of a commodity that comes from technology. And so to say that we need to have more people working in agriculture is entirely counter to any capitalist logic, right? That could not happen internal to a capitalist framework, which is something that he says very explicitly in this discussion he has of like food sovereignty and organic farming and this kind of stuff. Like capitalist logics cannot solve this food crisis that we are already entering into and will enter into, and it's only going to be some kind of new non-capitalist logic that will allow us to save ourselves, I suppose.
Yeah, I've been battling with that question the whole time I've been reading, because you're absolutely right. But it's also like he asks the question throughout it where he's like, but what, how capitalism responds to several questions, and one of them is, what is food? He talks about the next 2 decades as being extremely pivotal for what's going to come next, whether it's going to be this new ecological regime of capitalism or whether it's just going to have to be something else, worse, better, not capitalism. And I don't know, I suppose I'm always a bit like, I try and take a bit of a step back from when people have like doomsday, like this is going to be the end of capitalism, this is going to be the end of this, because it's like very much could just get all our proteins from like ground up bug meal, you know what I mean? Capitalists could just completely change the way that we think about what is food, and for that buys them like, I don't know, a couple decades, a couple of years, a century, I have no idea. But I suppose the answer to that then would be climate change is still going to be this thing. You know what I mean? It's still going to impact every aspect of our lives, no matter where you live. It's going to impact production. It's going to impact supply chains. It's going to impact everything. So it's very hard to kind of say where this collapse or transition is going to come from. I did find it really interesting because through all of this, I was also thinking about like the ways in which the four chiefs are not necessarily always aligned with each other. And one could create a model in their head of capitalism failing to have enough of, say, cheap raw materials, and that's the thing that collapses it, or cheap energy. We run out of coal, we can't build nuclear power plants, something like that. There's not enough stuff to make solar panels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because there's no room for like actually slowing things down. But it's really interesting the way in which these, peaks and troughs of the four chiefs has kind of come to a head in his mind as food and of labor power. And it's very disturbing, but I suppose I would just say maybe I would caution us against, I would suppose the way that we think about food now, capitalism can't solve that process. Capitalism can't keep growing corn from like Colorado to like the Appalachian Mountains and just have nothing in between. It can't keep that up for much longer. It can't, only survive on wheat, all of these different things, but we'll see. It just depends on what we consider food. I don't want to sound like some crackpot, but like a lot of people eat bugs. You know what I'm saying? A lot of more people could eat bugs. There's a market there. Buy bug futures, Dan. That's what I'm saying.
There is a section in this book when he talks about changing people's. It's like, I don't know whether, I think he describes it as like a cultural fix. Maybe?
Yeah, sure.
In the context of the narrative that he's describing, it comes up when he's talking about the transition to factory farming of meats and how that would have been, I suppose, objectionable or culturally abhorrent at some point in time, and capitalism exercises this fix where it makes it acceptable somehow. And sort of what you're describing is the possibility of some other kind of like cultural fix, right? Obviously, he's saying, and it seems evidently the case, that capitalism can't do what it has done over the past 100 years and can continue to use genetic modification to increase the yields from agriculture. We've exhausted the possible agricultural space, but also we have all of this sort of like negative value reaction from the environment that's sort of just making it untenable. But we sort of speculated last week, and you're right. Yeah, maybe there is some kind of like weird fix where they sort of create proteins by farming bacteria of some sort, and we'll just eat the dead husks of the yeast.
Soylent Green.
Exactly. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that doesn't solve. But that doesn't solve the contradictions that he's describing.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. No.
Just
Yeah.
sort of like,
it buys time.
it gets it into another cycle where climate change continues to do its damage, kind of thing. And he does say that, like, he makes the evident case that we've probably talked about before, or is quite obvious in left-wing discussions now, is that like there's no way to solve the climate crisis internal capitalism kind of thing. It's capitalism's logics. If he says quite explicitly, like, if capitalism wants to solve the climate crisis, it's going to have to, or it's going to undermine cheap energy, which is one of the four cheaps, right? Is it going to be willing to deliberately or intentionally make one of its cheaps incredibly expensive, and what is that going to do for the profitability of capitalism, kind of thing? So it just extends the crisis a bit further.
Sure,
but that's what this is true of all crisis theories.
That's
right?
what it's been doing
how long
for the
can
last.
Can you have a new fix? Can you have a new fix? And also there is the question of human agency. At what point the system doesn't have to collapse for the rest of us to decide, actually, no, maybe we'd rather just do the sort of organic farming food sovereignty thing.
Yeah, I suppose that's what capitalism has been doing ever since the beginning, and that's like his whole point of epochal crisis versus like, dynamic crisis or whatever. It's like it has been one long crisis. There has never been a point where it isn't in crisis. So what I'm just saying is that like the next 2 decades or whatever he says is like being the time where something is going to have to change. He's making the point that it is like this epochal crisis of capitalism. But I don't know. I'm always a bit like suspicious of people saying like, this is it. This is the one. Because people have been saying that since like the fall of the Neolithic Revolution. So, what are you going to do?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, we'll see. Bugs, people. Eat more bugs. I really love the way that he's able to, in focusing on relations and not just like labor relations, really tie in, like, much like Marx does, like technology and social relations and nature and the four cheaps and all of these different things, and like cultural fixes into like one tiny little package. Because Marx obviously is like, you can read him and be like, oh, well, everything is determined by the class struggle. But that's very much like not the only thing that's going on in Marx. There's obviously like technological determinism. There's like all of these different things going on. That's obviously like the core qualitative shift. But, in this, he talks about these cultural fixes as people being okay with, these new technologies, and technology as being like, a system of global railroads as being the thing that allows for this new ecological regime of global appropriation. So it isn't just, this book isn't necessarily just about like one thing. And I really find that like fascinating. He's able to tie everything up like in a really neat little bow. And so you can never accuse him of being like, well, this one thing is what determines everything. Obviously, he's making the point that like this balance of appropriation, exploitation, / just like trying to find a way of living in balance with our environment and recognizing that we are part of that environment is the most important thing, the oikios, right? But also like it's all, I suppose, like overdetermined, but it's all like, it's a web of life. Everything's connected. It's relational. It's really fantastic. And relations. It's the thing to focus on, I guess. Good book.
Yeah. It's fascinating. He's entirely Marxist in his thinking. And this whole book hangs upon value and the law of value. And I don't think he ever sort of like contradicts any sort of Marxist tenet. But as you're saying, he makes it much more systemic. It takes it out of this sort of like exclusively economic environment and sort of ties it into a much wider web of relations. So yeah, it's impressive. It's an impressive work.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it's not really talked about more. I mean, I know that like people on the left talk about it a lot, but like just that maybe it's just because nobody wants to use the word oikios or whatever. But really fantastic ideas in here, and I find it very refreshing, very very good. I think people are going to look back on this book in a while and be like, oh yeah, that's right. And I was also thinking about like what will people look back on in the future as like the legacy of capitalism. And when he focuses on, the web of life and ecology and all this stuff, that's going to be what people remember. They're going to be left with tornadoes everywhere. They're going to be left with hurricanes. They're going to be left with plastic everywhere and, a continent of super weeds. And they're going to go, yeah, that was the legacy of capitalism. It's going to be a lot harder to be like, it was abstract labor. You know what I mean? It was, not being able to go anywhere and find, the scars of like coal mining, you know what I mean? Yeah.
But that legacy of capitalism almost begins at the origin of capitalism kind of thing, in the sense that like capitalism and the law of value is a relationship to nature from the outset kind of thing, and it's rapaciously exploiting nature all the way through kind of thing. So
sure.
It's not gotten to a point, we've not gotten to a form of capitalism which is detrimental to our ecology. Like from the off it was that, and those contradictions are now emerging 400-500 years on kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. They were definitely there from the beginning, I would say. You could go to like Potosi and be like, this isn't how things should be, this seems bad. But what are you going to do? All right. Well, I think, more ecology in the future. Good stuff. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we aren't just ruined. And whenever we read ecology now, we're going to be like, but has this person considered the oikios? I would still think there's a conversation to be had about the easiness to explain, the ease with which you can explain metabolic rift to somebody versus this. But just the phrase ecological regime and environment making, I think, are hugely important. And metabolic rift is it's entry level. I would say it's not like, I would never tell people not to use that to like try and convince people of like the woes of capitalism or whatever. But yeah, well, this one might be a little bit harder to explain, a little bit harder to understand. I find it a lot more valuable, and the conclusions that you draw from it, very good, and perhaps inform our thinking a lot more than just like energy in versus energy out. Jason W. Moore, you've done it again. Very good. All right, well, we will be back in the future with more stuff, ecological or not. Hopefully, I think we're going to try and maybe take a break from ecology before we get right back into it, but it'll be good. Yeah, and if there's still in England in 2 weeks, we'll see you then.
Yeah, see you next time. Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Something exciting in the future, no doubt.
The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.